I hope everyone's doing well on this beautiful Sunday morning. While I was getting prepared for this a few weeks ago, a question came to my mind. The question of why? Why do I feel obligated to speak? And I think the reason is because I know the truth. If you know anything about me, you know that I'm a busy person. I am a single household income. I own my own business. I'm a family man, and I'm an elder at this church. So I don't have much time on my hands. So why do I feel like I need to spend 6 months to prepare for this right here? And I think it's because I know the truth. The truth, and I believe that a harmless man is not a good man. I believe that a good man is a dangerous man who has it under voluntary control. I do not believe pacifism is a good trait. I believe that you need to be a monster and to be able to bridle that power for good. I also believe, so what is our most powerful weapon that we have? I mean, we can be physically fit, and that might give us the confidence to be able to defeat our enemies, but the most powerful weapon that we have is our ability to speak. Is there an echo in here? It is not. I will use the mic. Is that any better? All right, good deal. Sorry about that. So, if you really want to know what it's like to be in the kingdom of God, learn to sharpen your tongue. The ability to speak is our most powerful weapon because words alone has risen armies. Words alone has toppled empires. And so if you really want to be the best person you can be, learn how to use your words to do so. I believe that all humans are aiming creatures. We see a point out into the distance and we move towards that point. And that can even be a point in time. And we can see ourselves into the future. And one thing that I realize in my own life is, why don't I aim towards the greatest good I can possibly be? And one way that I like to do that is to imagine myself as an avatar in a video game. I like to play video games. And so I imagine myself the way that I am now and the way that I used to be. And that should be the only person you ever compare yourself to, is who you used to be. Because that will project you into the future, and that has potential. You'll have plenty of you that you can become, so why wouldn't you want to aim towards the best you can possibly be? And if you continue that line of logic, you're going to realize you went 2 weeks, maybe a year, and you realize my aim was a little off, so you move it a little bit. And so throughout life, you're going to be waving, going through your life. So at the end of that road, I've realized the greatest good that we can possibly conceptualize, the greatest good that we can possibly think of is God. Because He is goodness, He is life, He is light. And of course, if you continue that, you'll realize that Jesus is that God. And so that's what I feel like I'm aiming towards, is I'm aiming towards the good, which is only going to be good for me. And that puts my entire life into perspective. I realize what matters and what doesn't matter. And so that reorients your whole life into what really matters. And so if you're aiming, I got to thinking, if you're aiming towards the good, towards God, does that mean you believe in God? Because the word belief is such a multidimensional word. It doesn't mean that you just state the sentence, I believe. It means you have that aim. You live your life fully towards that aim. Your whole perspective of your life is centered around that. How many of us can say that we can do that 100%? So who would dare say that they believed and meant it fully? Because that means that you completely let go of all your malevolence, all your hatred, all your desires for destruction, and you only cling on to that which is good, that which is righteous. How many of us can say that we do that? I believe that I believe that if we were even capable of doing such a thing, that it would be such a transfiguring event, that our whole lives would completely change, and people would see that. And I know people have experienced that from time to time, but I mean, what would you be if you were all in? What would you become? Only God knows what you would become. And I've had that transfiguring event. I've probably said I believed in God ever since I was able to talk, but I didn't know what that meant. I went from 0% to 5% maybe, and it was life-changing. It changed my entire perspective of what was right and wrong and what I needed to aim towards in life. So that's what I believe. That's what I believe whenever we say we believe. We need to act as if there is a God, and we aim towards it and move it. And so that's what I'm doing up here. That's my why. It's because I think what I'm doing is good. I think being silent is bad. Being harmless is not good. So I'm not going to be silent, and I'm not going to be harmless. Because if you're harmless and the enemy is at your door, you better hope you're a monster at that time. So what I have to talk about today is a little deep, so please bear with me. What is the most certain thing that all humans can say exists? I believe pain and suffering must be way up there, because it's impossible for us to deny the reality of our own pain. And with the reality of pain that we all believe, the reality of suffering, it can put safety boundaries within our minds, and it can enslave us in some ways if we allow it. And so that begs the question, is that which overcomes pain and suffering even more real? And I believe that is one of the core things behind the passion of Christ, which is what Jesus went through on the cross. And so that's what we have to talk about today. We're going to start out in the book of Exodus. And I'm not going to read anything specific out of it. I'm just going to sweep through the story. There may be some words up there of what I'm saying, but I'm going to try to be as quick as possible with this. The story of Exodus is about Moses leading the Israelites across the desert. And it starts out with a tyrannical state of the Egyptians over the Hebrews. And it was a spirit of God that swelled up inside of them to long for freedom. Now, that's a strange idea, because in our Western culture, we seem to think that slavery, yeah, that's obviously wrong, but these things are not so obvious. You must have a real good grasp of what morality is before you can understand that slavery is wrong. Because morality does not come from our societal standards. Morality comes from a lawgiver beyond ourselves that writes it onto our hearts. Now, morality is not what I have to talk about, but I can literally talk about that for a long time. The proof of reality and proof how that leads to God as well. So slavery is only wrong if we are sovereign individuals, that God is saying to us here that it's inappropriate for us to be in bondage, that is not a part of our lives. If we are Israel means we who struggle with God, it is not right for us to be enslaved. And so the idea that slavery is wrong came from God, and this is actually its origin, the Exodus story. So the story talks about there being a state of tyranny over our lives. But why don't we address the state of tyranny that we put ourselves in within our mind? I mean, the story could be talking about that as well, because we enslave ourselves with our own presuppositions all the time. And a presupposition is something that we think is true, and we apply it to our lives, but it isn't necessarily true, and we don't really know if it's not, but we go ahead and allow it to sink into our hearts. We presuppose the truth that we're putting in ourselves. And a lot of times these ideas are oppressive, and they're not good for us, but we cling on to them. And I thought, why do we do that? Why don't we let go of them and seek the truth within that? But a lot of times we don't, and even sometimes celebrate them. It's a very odd thing. And I think the story has an answer for that as well, because it isn't from the tyranny to the promised land. It's not from slavery and bondage until the land of milk and honey. There's the desert. And who would want to leave the comforts of slavery, which means the people have shelter over their heads, they have clothes on their backs, they have purpose in their life. And why would they give all that up to go wander free in the desert where there is no certainty? It's a very hard question in the Exodus narrative, whether the slavery, whether the tyranny is better or not than the desert. And this question also comes up in recent history. There's a book called The Good Old Days. It's written by the guards in the days in the Soviet Union who pined for the days of Stalin. So I don't think there is a tyranny so brutal that we can't long for it after it's been broken. So if we go back to the Israelites in the desert, they wander the desert for 40 years. So what happens? Well, the same thing happening to them is happening to us today. They are tempted and they are worshiping false idols. And it really is no wonder that they're being tempted and worshiping false idols, because they're in the desert and it's not going so well. Maybe they're pining for the old days. Maybe they're questioning the God that said being under bondage was such a bad thing, and so they lack faith. And honestly, it is understandable because we are human. So what does God do? And this is one of the harshest things about the story. He sends a bunch of poisonous snakes in to bite them. And you might think, an all-merciful God sending in snakes to bite his people? That is harsh. But if you think about it, what happens when you lose your faith and you're in a desert? The snakes are going to bite you. If you realize that if you imagine yourself in a little analog of hell and you lose your faith, is that going to make it better or worse? And you might have the question, you might say, well, I have a reason to lose my faith. Look, I'm in the desert. But that isn't the question. The question is it going to make things better? And the answer is no. Hell gets a little deeper. And that's what I found out while doing a study about a metaphorical version of hell as a bottomless pit, because there's always some stupid thing that you can do to make your situation worse. And I believe that is so true. I believe that's so true. So, poisonous snakes. So not only are they lost in the desert, but venomous creatures. They're going to have to tend with these venomous creatures. And so what do? They realize their faults and they go to Moses and say, Moses, can you please tell God to maybe take away these snakes and then we'll act better? And Moses says, well, I'll see what I can do. And going to talk to God is no trivial thing, but that's what happens. But God does not do what you expect him to do. He never does. He tells Moses to cast a snake in bronze and then lift it up onto a staff. And every bit of that is symbolism, and you can do a lot of study on that. But basically what I got out of it is the staff could be referred to maybe the staff of Moses, maybe a staff of God, maybe even refers to the tree of life. Maybe it's the thing that you orient yourself, a center point to orient yourself throughout life. And of course, the snake is pretty obvious here. It is the source of suffering that they're dealing with at that moment, the snakes. And so, oddly enough, a symbol of fear and suffering becomes a symbol of healing and transformation because of what God says next. He tells them, to whoever was bitten by the snakes, to look at the bronze snake, and the poison will not poison you anymore. I think what God is trying to tell us here is if you have fear, if you have suffering in your life, pay more attention to it. And in the psychological field, this is called voluntary exposure. It means if you have a source of fear and you go out and face it, you become braver. And that's not the same as not being afraid. It means you are overcoming your fear. You realize that there is something inside of you that was more than what you thought. And you literally conquered that fear. I believe that is what God is trying to tell us here, is in order to conquer your fears, you have to face them face to face. And a good example of this in the Bible is with Noah and the ark. God says to Noah, hey, there's a storm coming, and there's going to be so much suffering because of it. So many people are going to be wiped out, and what I want you to do is to focus in on that storm for years by building an ark, so that way you and your family can survive it. And so if a storm of life comes in your life and your ark is only halfway built, get prepared. So I believe this is a good way of building your arks in your life. And a real-world example that I found out I thought was very relevant, and I think it should talk to a lot of people, especially young men, is to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. And what I mean by that is, you know that storm is coming. You know that flood, your entire life is going to be flooded with misery and sorrow, and your family is going to be going through the same thing. So why don't you pre-expose your emotions to that storm, so that way whenever that storm does happen, the hell that you and your family are going through wouldn't be as deep. You become the ark for the people who need you, that you can support. And why would you want to aim to anything else besides the greatest conceptual good that you can think of? So be that strong person for the people around you. So the snake becomes a symbol of healing and transformation. And I believe that links so close to what the cross does for us. It is the greatest symbol of transformation. And so that's going to lead us to the next part. In John 3:14, when Christ says that he must be lifted up like the snake in the wilderness, I read that and I'm like, what does that mean? Why on earth would the Son of God compare himself to a snake, a source of fear and suffering? I thought that's so odd for God to do that. And so I had to break it down. And so there's this old corpus of stories, like a backbone throughout human history, that all good stories are told. And the story goes kind of like this. You have a hero of the story, and he's in a walled garden. The garden is supposed to represent everything that he ever needs. He's in a safe haven, and the wall represents it keeps the chaos of the world out, the suffering of the world out. And so the hero, he climbs the wall and looks out in the abyss of chaos. And he looks long and hard into it. And he sees the beast. He sees the dragon, or even Satan himself, the source of suffering. That's what that's supposed to represent. He looks inside the beast and he sees his father has been devoured by the beast. And so what does the hero do? Does he turn his back? No. He ventures out into the chaos. He faces fear itself and defeats it. And the father is supposed to be represented by maybe the treasure at the end of a level in a video game. It reacquaints you with what is right, to what is true. And you'll never figure out what is right and true unless you step out into the chaos and face your fears. You'll never know what you're truly made of. You'll never get that treasure if you don't try, if you don't face your fear. And I believe every story in human history has that backbone in it. And so that led me to the next thing. Well, what does the Bible say about serpents and their relationships? Well, the most famous serpent is the one in the Garden of Eden, which the Garden of Eden is also a walled garden, by the way. And so it's not really outright said in Genesis that the snake is Satan. That's an equation that comes up after hundreds of years of study. And I'm wondering, how did that happen? How did that snake in particular become Satan? And I'm not 100% about all this, but this is what I concluded. I believe that Satan is the ultimate serpent, that he is the biggest bad guy. And so one way that you can think of this is by asking the question, well, what threatens you? Well, snakes threaten you. Well, if you defeat your snake, what's the next step? What's the next level of the game? Well, it's the snake pit, the origin of the snakes. And so you go out and defeat the origin, the snake pit. So let's go from the physical to the psychological. What about the snakes and the hearts of your enemies? That's such a harder snake to deal with. Where are its origins? And I believe that the worst snake of all is the snakes that we have in our own hearts. Does that mean that we are most vulnerable to the worst impulses that we have within ourselves? I don't know. That's a tough question. And so the idea of the serpent and Satan becomes psychologized into the predator that can live within inside of us. And that got me to thinking, while the Israelites were in the desert, why doesn't God just take away all the snakes? He's an infinite being with infinite power. He could just take the snakes away, but he doesn't. And I think maybe the reason he doesn't do that is because maybe it's better, and I'm not sure about this. This is something I've been working on. Maybe it's better to live in a world with snakes than it is to live in a world where there is no danger. Because what is going to call the best out of us if there is no danger? And I believe it's a way that we can become better people if we have a challenge set before us. And so, and then Christ makes this reference to himself and the snake. I believe that the snake, and I've said this before, I believe that the snake is the thing that we fear. And so is the passion of Christ the sum total of all possible fears? I believe that is true. I believe that what happened to Jesus, the story of Jesus, is an archetypal tragedy. And what that means is you cannot write a more tragic story than what happened to Jesus on the cross. And a way that I can explain that is by distilling everything that we know to be a tragic story. And we come up with the most tragic story that is possible. And so let's flesh that out. For instance, it's tragic when something bad happens to somebody. Well, what if they deserved it? In that case, it's not so tragic. So, does that mean that the most tragic story is the worst possible punishment visited on the least person who least deserves it? And I think that is so core to the passion of Christ because it was the worst punishment, because crucifixion is bad, worst possible death, and the Romans designed it to be that way. And God, Jesus, he is innocent. Not only innocent, but good. And not just good, he is as good as it gets. And there's so many different layers on that story because it's not just that he's innocent, it's that he's good. And he was betrayed by his friend. He was sentenced to death at a young age by a mob of his own people who were suffering under a tyranny that led to his death. And they let somebody go who they know to be a criminal, and they decide they knew that he was innocent, and they decided to let him die instead of somebody who they know is criminal. And so I believe all that put together, it is the sum total of all possible fears. And I think it's very strange that how, as Christians, we put into the center of our lives an archetypal tragedy. It is like we're trying to inoculate ourselves of the catastrophes of the world. But the funny thing is, the crucifixion is not the end of the story. It's the resurrection. Facing your fear isn't the end of the story. It's the recovery. And so that begs the question, and this is central to what I have to talk about, is to what degree are we able to confront, to bear suffering and prevail? And I think it's to the same degree that we are able to confront it forthrightly. Because what is going to call the best out of you? It's not going to happen out of nowhere. You really have to be shaken to the core before you're put into that alignment. You have to be shaken to the core before you can make the proper sacrifices to be able to become the best person you could possibly be. And that's not just going to happen by somebody knocking on your door. No. So, does that mean we should be grateful for our suffering? That is a high standard. I'm not sure about that, but that's a high standard. But what I do know is that we as Christians, we come to the cross, which is the source of fear and suffering, and we become healed from the poison of the world. I believe that is so core to what it means to be a Christian. And in doing so, I believe we live free because of it. We live free even though that we are in the desert. And so with that, I'm going to try to conclude. So who is the enemy exactly? You can turn on the news and you can see that the Republicans, they say, oh, there's something bubbling underneath our society, and the perpetrators are coming for you and they're coming for me. But then you can turn on the TV and the Democrats, they'll say the same thing. Is there something coming for us, bubbling underneath our society? Why don't we ask that of ourselves? Are we more worried about the dust in our enemy's eyes than to deal with the filth that obscures our own vision? So what do we want? Do we want destruction? Do we want hatred? Do we want malevolence? Do we want betrayal? Or do we want the peace and prosperity that beckons to us at this moment like never before? So who is the enemy? Is it the baskets of deplorables and the freaks? Or maybe it's the plumbers and carpenters and tradesmen who work honestly and diligently throughout the day. Or maybe it's the soldiers who defend our borders. Or maybe it's the artists who entertain us and rejuvenate us. Or maybe it's the visionaries that give us so many technological miracles after another technological miracle. Or maybe it's our institutions that are our enemies, the ones that so many people have lived and died to help build. And with all their faults, they really have served us well. So in light of this, what do we really want? Do we want revenge or justice? Do we want contempt or mercy? Do we want war or peace? We have to ask ourselves, what are we aiming at? Because I have seen the best of men fall to the exchange of blows. I've seen the best of men who identify the enemy in our friends and neighbors and families. I've seen the best of men be consumed by a self-righteous anger, and it needs to stop. I need to stop. You need to stop. So who is the enemy? Is it the snakes in our hearts? Is it the lies on our tongue? Is it the arrogance of our own intellect? Is it the cowardice of our refusal to see? I believe that the enemy is the one who divides, that sows discord. The enemy is the one that's the fear that stops us from lending a hand across the divide. It is our eternal enemy of mankind. And if we demonize our brothers and sisters, do we not call that kind of spirit forth into our own lives? I mean, as Christians, have we not learned courage? Have we not learned trust, truth, and love? Even unto our enemies. So what do? We have to tell them the truth. We have to tell the ones that we love how to avoid the road to hell. And it's not because we sit up on a pedestal and say we have the moral authority and wave a finger at them. No. We tell them because we don't want to watch them burn. And I believe there's still too much of the moral authority still left in the church. And not enough of the love that truly cares for the lost and the suffering. So, what does that mean? If you do not tell them, you do not love them, that means if you do not love them, do you not know God? Think about that. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day. Lord, please lift from us our arrogance, our refusal to see, and our hatred. Lord, please forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lord, let what is highest guide our vision. Let what is highest guide our ears. And let what is highest guide our tongues. Lord, please shine a light into our dark hearts so that way we don't so easily get consumed by the hell that we can create. Lord, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you guys so much.